The office was busy that morning. People moving from desk to desk, typing on keyboards, phones ringing again and again. It was the same routine every day, and everyone already knew their place in the company. Some were loud and proud, some were quiet and forgotten. Among them was a young man who always worked hard, but no one really noticed him. He never talked much, he just focused on his tasks. While others laughed and joked around the coffee machine, he kept his head down. On that day, the boss called a meeting. Everyone gathered in the conference room. The boss was a man who loved to hear his own voice. He enjoyed making fun of people. It made him feel powerful. He was tall, sharp-suited, and always wore a smirk that showed he thought he was above everyone. The workers sat down, holding their notepads, waiting for the usual talk. The young man sat in the corner, quietly, hoping not to be noticed. He always felt nervous in meetings, not because he was weak, but because he hated attention. He wanted his work to speak for him, not his words. The boss started the meeting, walking back and forth, speaking loudly about targets and sales. Every few minutes he stopped to throw a sarcastic comment at someone. People laughed nervously. No one wanted to upset him. Then suddenly his eyes stopped on the young man in the corner. The room grew a little tense. The boss smirked and said, You always sit there so silent, like a ghost. Do you even have any hidden talents, or are you just here to fill space?" Everyone laughed. The young man lowered his eyes, his ears burned, he wanted to disappear. The boss was enjoying the moment. He leaned closer, his voice dripping with mockery. "Tell you what, if you can play the piano, I'll make you CEO tomorrow." The room exploded with laughter. People slapped their desks. Some covered their mouths to hide their smiles, but everyone found it funny. It was cruel, but no one dared to speak against the boss. The young man felt humiliated. The laughter echoed in his ears like knives stabbing into his chest. He had always been careful to avoid attention, but now all eyes were on him, not with respect, but with mockery. His throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck inside him. Instead, he gave a small nod and lowered his gaze again, pretending it didn't matter, but inside something stirred. The boss had no idea what he had just awakened, because hidden in the young man's past was a secret, one that no one in the office knew. He once had a life filled with music. His fingers once moved gracefully across piano keys, creating melodies that touched hearts, but no one here could imagine that. They only saw a quiet worker in the corner. The meeting went on. The boss continued speaking about numbers. The laughter slowly faded, but for the young man, those mocking words remained like fire in his chest. "If you can play the piano, I'll make you CEO." He kept hearing it again and again. The humiliation turned into determination. Something inside him whispered, "I will not let this end here." After the meeting, when everyone left, co-workers still chuckled to each other. One whispered, "Can you imagine him on a piano? He can't even speak up in a meeting." Another laughed and said, "CEO, ha, that was a good one." They walked past him without care, not knowing that their words were only adding fuel to the quiet fire now burning inside him. He returned to his desk, hands slightly shaking but his mind sharper than ever. He typed slowly, pretending to be calm, but inside his heart beat faster. He remembered his childhood when he used to sit at the old wooden piano in his parents' home, how his mother smiled when he played, how his father clapped proudly. Music once filled his life with joy. But those days were gone, buried under responsibilities and pain. Yet at that moment he realized something powerful. The boss thought it was a joke. The co-workers thought it was impossible. But he knew the truth. He could play, not just play, but play with passion, play with a soul that carried both love and loss. If he wanted, he could silence their laughter. He could turn the mockery into shock. He could take the challenge. As the day went on, the young man spoke to no one, but in his mind, he was already planning. He would go home. He would touch those dusty piano keys again. He would practice until his fingers remembered every note, and he would not stop. He felt the flame burning inside him, something stronger than shame, stronger than fear. It was resolve. The boss thought it was just a careless joke, a throwaway line to make everyone laugh, but for the young man it became a turning point, a moment that would change his life. As the office lights dimmed and workers went home, he carried the words in his chest. Not like a wound, but like a promise. What began as humiliation was slowly turning into something else. A challenge, a chance, and perhaps a path that no one in that office, not even the boss, could have predicted. That night he went home quietly, walking through the crowded streets but hearing nothing except the echo of the boss's mocking voice. The laughter of his co-workers followed him like a shadow. Every step felt heavy. His heart was still burning with both shame and determination. When he reached his small apartment, he locked the door behind him, leaned against it, and closed his eyes. The silence of the room wrapped around him, but inside his mind there was no silence. There were memories, memories he had pushed away for years. In the corner of the living room, under a white sheet, stood an old piano, its edges worn, its wood scratched by time. It had been sitting there untouched for so long that even dust had made a permanent home on its surface. He slowly walked toward it, each step pulling him back into the past. He pulled off the sheet, sending dust into the air, and there it was, the piano of his childhood, the piano that had once been the voice of his heart. His fingers brushed against the keys. They felt cold, lifeless, but also familiar, as if they were waiting for him all this time. His throat tightened as old images flashed in his mind. He remembered being a boy, sitting on the same piano bench, his mother standing behind him with a gentle smile. She used to say, "Every key you touch has a voice, let it sing." His father would come home from work, tired but smiling, and sit in the chair by the window just to listen. Their little home was filled with music, soft, bright, and full of life. But those days were gone, taken away too quickly. His parents passed away one after another, leaving him alone to survive. The piano, once the center of his world, became a painful reminder of what he lost. He had covered it, locked those memories inside, and walked into a world of offices, papers, and long hours, trying to bury his pain under routine. Now, because of one cruel joke, those memories had risen again. The boss thought he was mocking a man with no talent, but in truth he had woken something that had been asleep for years. The young man sat down on the bench, his heart racing, his hands trembling. He pressed a single key. The sound was sharp and slightly out of tune, but it cut through the silence of the room like lightning. He pressed another key, then another. The sounds were broken, uneven, but familiar. His fingers stumbled. His hands remembered, but his body resisted. It had been so long. Yet with every mistake he felt something returning, something alive. He closed his eyes and tried to play the simple tune his mother once taught him. At first it sounded weak, clumsy, but then his hands slowly found the rhythm. The notes floated in the room, not perfect but full of feeling. For the first time in years, the apartment felt alive. The young man smiled faintly, but at the same time tears gathered in his eyes. The sound of the piano was not only music, it was his past, his pain, and his hope. Each note reminded him of who he used to be, of the dream he had abandoned. As the melody grew, he remembered the cafes where he once played in his teenage years. He had taken small jobs at local shops, performing for a few coins just to help his parents with bills. Strangers would clap for him, sometimes even ask for more. He was not famous, not rich, but he was alive, and his music gave him strength. He stopped playing suddenly and looked at his hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. It was something else, excitement. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if he had just woken from a long sleep. He realized that music was still a part of him, buried but not dead, and maybe it was time to bring it back. He stood up and looked at the piano, the keys still shining faintly under the dim light. He whispered to himself, "I can do this." It was not just about proving the boss wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was more than the quiet worker they laughed at. Deep inside, he carried something special, and maybe the world needed to hear it again. The night grew late. The city outside slowed down, but inside that small apartment, the young man sat again and again at the piano, practicing, his fingers clumsy at first, then steadier. Each mistake only made him try harder. He lost track of time. The music filled the room, sometimes soft like a whisper, sometimes strong like a storm. When he finally stopped, The clock showed. Past midnight, he leaned back, exhausted but alive. A small smile touched his lips. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a shadow. He felt like someone with a voice, someone with power. The boss's mocking words had been cruel, but now they had become fuel. They had forced him to face the part of himself he had hidden away. And though his heart still ached from the past, he felt a new fire burning inside. The journey would not be easy, but he knew he was ready to take it. As he turned off the light and went to bed, the echo of the piano stayed in the room. It was imperfect, rusty, but it was his. And it whispered to him through the darkness, reminding him that he was more than they thought, more than the laughter, more than the quiet corner of an office. He was someone with music inside, and now he was ready to let the world hear it again. The next day at the office, he looked the same as always, quiet, focused, moving papers and answering emails. No one could see that something had changed inside. Him? His coworkers still laughed about the boss's joke, whispering in corners. They thought it was over, just another funny moment to remember. But the young man carried a secret now. Every hour he spent at work, his mind was already counting the minutes until he could return home to the piano. When evening came, he hurried back to his apartment, locked the door, and went straight to the instrument. He did not even change his clothes. His fingers touched. The keys and the sound filled the room again. At first the notes were broken, sometimes sharp, sometimes soft. His hands stumbled often, but he did not stop. The mistakes only made him try harder. He was determined to bring the music back. Night after night he sat at the piano. The neighbors began to notice. Some would walk slower past his window, listening to the melodies drifting into the street. At first it was clumsy, but little by little it started to sound beautiful. The old woman across the hall smiled when she heard him. Children passing by would stop and whisper, "Someone is playing." The music was spreading, even though he never told anyone. Inside his apartment, he pushed himself more and more. He played until his fingers hurt. Sometimes blisters formed, but he wrapped his hands and continued. He tried the songs he once knew, the ones he had played as a boy, the ones that made his mother hum along. Sometimes he failed. Sometimes the notes did not connect, but then a familiar rhythm returned and it gave him hope. In those hours of practice, he felt alive in a way the office never gave him. The stress, the humiliation, the laughter of his boss slowly faded when he played. Music became his shield, his strength. It gave him focus and peace even when he was tired. Even when his body begged him to rest, he kept going. One night, after many attempts, he finally played a whole piece without stopping. The notes flowed like water, soft and smooth. His eyes filled with tears as the last key echoed in the room. He leaned forward and let out a shaky laugh. He had done it. His talent was still there, buried but alive, and now growing stronger. He began setting a routine, work in the day, practice. In the night, slowly his hands grew faster, his mind sharper. He started exploring new melodies, not only the old ones. He began creating his own, small tunes that came from his heart. They carried his emotions, his anger, his pain, his determination. Sometimes, he closed his eyes and imagined the office, the boss's smirk, the co-workers' laughter, and then he played with fire, letting the music answer their cruelty. The piano became his voice, a voice that no one at work knew existed, but one day they would. Weeks passed, the practice continued, and he started to feel different even in the office, though he said nothing. He walked a little taller. His eyes did not always drop to the floor. He had a secret world waiting for him at home, and it gave him strength to endure their whispers. He no longer felt only shame. He felt a quiet confidence. One evening, while playing, he did not notice that his window was slightly open. A small group of children gathered outside, listening. To him, their faces lit with wonder. When he finished, they clapped, surprising him. He blushed and quickly closed the window, but inside, his heart swelled. People were listening. People cared, even if they were strangers. His music touched them. Another time, a man from the next building knocked on his door. He said softly, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your playing brings peace to my nights, thank you." The young man stood frozen, not knowing how to respond. He only nodded, but inside he felt something powerful. His gift was not only for himself, it was for others too. The secret practice became more than just revenge against the boss's mockery. It became healing. It became a way to connect. He started realizing that music was not just sound, it was emotion. It was truth. It was something that could not be taken away by laughter or insults. Every night he promised himself that he would not stop until he was ready for the day when he would sit in front of everyone and show them who he truly was. No words, no arguments, just music, pure and undeniable. Sometimes when he grew tired, doubt whispered in his ear. Could he really do this? Would anyone even care? But then he remembered the boss's words, "I'll make you CEO if you can play the piano." And the fire returned. It was not about the title. It was about proving that he was more than what they saw, more than a joke. By the end of the third week, his apartment no longer felt like a lonely place. It was alive with sound, filled with his determination. When he lay down to sleep, the tunes still echoed in his head, comforting him, guiding him, pushing him forward. He was still the quiet worker at the office, still the man mocked in meetings, but in the silence of his home, he was something greater. He was a pianist again, a creator, and though the world did not know it yet, he felt it in his bones. The day would come when they would hear him, and they would not laugh. They would listen. One Saturday evening, he decided to do something different. There was a small charity event being held at a local community hall. It was a fundraiser for children in need. They needed entertainment, and a friend of a neighbor had asked if he could play a few pieces. At first he hesitated, fear tightening his chest, but then he thought about all the nights he had practiced. All the hours he had poured into the piano he could not hide forever, so he agreed quietly. When the evening came, he sat nervously behind the piano on stage. The lights above were not as bright as a grand concert hall, but for him it felt like the world was watching. A small crowd of families, children, and local workers filled the hall. He pressed the first key, and his hands began to move. The music was soft at first, shaky like his heartbeat, but then it grew, flowing smoothly, filling the space with warmth. The audience went silent, their eyes on him. Some leaned forward in their seats, drawn by the beauty of the melody. Children stopped, whispering. Parents smiled and held hands. The young man closed his eyes and let the music take him away. Every note carried years of pain, years of silence, and years of longing. He forgot his fear. He forgot his doubt. In that moment, he was not the quiet worker in the office. He was himself, pure and unhidden. When the last note faded, the hall erupted in applause. People clapped loudly, some even stood up. A little boy shouted, "Play again," and laughter of joy filled the room. His cheeks burned with both embarrassment and happiness. He had not felt this alive in years. He bowed his head slightly and smiled. It was small, but it was real. What he did not know was that someone from his office had been there, a co-worker who lived nearby. She had come for the charity but left with wide eyes. She could not believe what she saw. The same quiet man from the corner desk was the one who had filled the hall with music. The next morning at work, she whispered it to another colleague. "You won't believe it, but he can play the piano, and not just play, he's amazing." The rumor began like a spark in dry grass. One person told another. Soon half the office had heard the story. Some laughed even louder. "Piano? Him? Impossible." They shook their heads, thinking it was just an exaggeration. Others frowned and said, "No, I heard he really played at the charity." Still, many treated it like a silly secret, something to gossip about between tasks. In the lunchroom, two men joked, "Hey, maybe he's practicing for his CEO position." Laughter filled the air, but behind the laughter was curiosity. What if it was true? What if the quiet worker really could do something great? The young man heard the whispers. He saw the glances. He knew the rumor had spread, but he did not react. He kept his head down. As always, inside though, he felt a mix of fear and strength. Part of him worried they would laugh even harder, but another part whispered, "Let them talk. One day they will see." Even the boss heard the rumor. Someone mentioned it during a coffee. Break, the boss smirked, raised an eyebrow and said, "That boy? Playing piano? I bet he can't even play Happy Birthday." His voice was filled with arrogance. He dismissed the idea as nonsense. To him, it was impossible that the quiet man could shine. He continued his day, making fun of others, sure that nothing could threaten his control. But something subtle was changing. Some co-workers started looking at the young man differently. One woman asked softly at his desk, "Is it true? Do you play?" He only gave a small smile and said nothing. Her eyes widened. She understood that silence was not denial. It was confirmation. Soon she told others. The rumor now carried two sides, one of mockery and one of respect. Half of the office laughed, the other half grew curious. Those who had once ignored him began to notice the quiet strength in his eyes. They wondered what else they never knew about him. At home, he continued to practice harder than ever. The spreading whispers did not discourage him. They fueled him. He imagined the faces of his co-workers when they finally heard the truth. He imagined the boss's smirk falling away. Every night, his fingers danced across the keys with more determination. One evening, as he played, he thought about the charity crowd clapping for him. The joy on their faces, the respect in their eyes. He realized that music was not only his weapon against humiliation, it was his gift to people. It had power. And that power was growing. At the office, the tension built. The joke that was once a throwaway line had now become something people whispered about daily. The boss still laughed, but others began waiting for the chance to see for themselves, waiting for the day when the quiet worker would stop being invisible. The young man knew that day was coming. He could feel it, like a storm building far away. He did not know when or how, but he knew the world would not laugh forever. They would listen, and when they did, everything would change. The weeks rolled on and the rumor did not die. Instead, it grew stronger. Everyone in the office knew about the charity night by now. Some laughed less than before. Some grew more curious. But the boss still treated it like a joke. To him, it was nothing more than office gossip. He was too busy preparing for the company's biggest event of the year, a grand fundraiser sponsored by the company itself. This event was no small matter. Important clients, investors, and even local officials were invited. It was a night where the company showed its strength, its wealth, and its reputation. The boss wanted everything perfect. The food, the decorations, the speeches, the entertainment. Nothing could go wrong. He wanted the night to reflect his own power. The week before the event, something unexpected happened. The hired band that was supposed to perform called to cancel. One of their members had fallen sick and they could not make it. The organizer panicked. They needed entertainment. Music was always the highlight of the evening. Without it, the event would lose its charm. The boss was furious when he heard the news. He slammed his desk and shouted at the staff, "How can they cancel now? Find someone else immediately." His assistants scrambled, but every option was too expensive or already booked. Time was running out. The boss paced back and forth, red with anger. Then one bold co-worker, perhaps out of nervousness or maybe with a spark of mischief, said, "Why not let him play?" All eyes turned to the quiet young man sitting at his desk, typing away as if nothing was happening. The room went silent for a moment. Then laughter broke out. The boss narrowed his eyes, smirked, and said, "Now that's an idea. Imagine him on stage in front of our clients. It would be the best joke of the night." The assistants chuckled, though some looked uncertain. The co-worker shrugged. "At least it's free." The boss leaned back in his chair, enjoying the thought. He could already picture the young man stumbling, embarrassing himself in front of everyone, giving the boss yet another reason to mock him. Finally, he waved his hand and said, "Fine. Let him play if he dares. At least it will entertain the guests." When the news reached him, the young man froze. His heart skipped a beat. This was the chance he had never expected, the very moment he had been preparing for without knowing it. But fear gripped him too. The fundraiser was not a small charity night. It was a grand event, filled with powerful people. A mistake could destroy him. That evening he walked home in silence, his thoughts heavy. He sat at his piano, staring at the keys, his hands trembling. Was he ready? Could he face not just his co-workers, but strangers of high status? What if he failed? The laughter would crush him. But then he remembered the charity night, the clapping, the joy on people's faces. He remembered the words of his mother telling him that every key had a voice, and he remembered the boss's mocking promise. "I'll make you CEO if you can play the piano." The flame inside him grew again. This was not just a chance, it was destiny. He began practicing harder than ever before. Night after night he poured his soul into the piano. His neighbors noticed the difference. The music was no longer clumsy or hesitant. It was strong, confident, filled with emotion. Sometimes soft like a prayer, sometimes fierce like thunder. The children who listened outside whispered that he sounded like a real concert pianist. At work, whispers filled the air. Some said he would never do it. Others said they hoped he would. Even those who once mocked him now waited in secret excitement. The office atmosphere shifted. The quiet worker who had once been invisible was suddenly at the center of attention. The boss still laughed, bragging to others that it would be the funniest performance of the night. But a few co-workers who had seen his eyes, the quiet fire burning there, began to doubt. Something told them that maybe, just maybe, this time, the joke would not go as planned. The night of the fundraiser arrived. The hall was filled with lights, golden chandeliers, and tables dressed in white cloth. Businessmen in suits and women in elegant dresses filled the room. Laughter and chatter echoed everywhere. Waiters carried trays of wine and food. The boss moved proudly among the guests, shaking hands and smiling. In one corner, the young man sat silently by the piano, his suit simple, his hands resting nervously on his lap. He looked small among the glamorous crowd, but inside him, his heart was roaring. This was the night, the chance that fate had placed before him. The boss walked past him, smirked, and said loudly enough for others to hear, "Don't disappoint us, play something that makes us laugh." The guest nearby chuckled. The young man only nodded, but deep inside he whispered to himself, "I won't make you laugh, I'll make you listen." The program went on. Speeches were made, toasts were given, then finally the time for music arrived. The host announced nervously that their own employee would perform tonight. The guests exchanged surprised looks. The boss sat back with a smug grin, ready to enjoy the show. The young man stood, his legs shaking but his eyes steady. He walked to the piano. The crowd grew quiet, some expecting a disaster, others curious. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and waited for the silence to settle. The hall was ready, the people were waiting. The boss was smirking, and in that moment, he knew everything would change. The first key was about to decide his fate. The hall was silent as he sat at the piano, the lights above shining down, making his hands look pale and trembling. Every eye in the room was on him. The bosses, the investors, the guests in fine clothes. Even the waiters paused as they carried trays, waiting to see what would happen. His heart pounded so loudly that he thought others could hear it. His throat was dry, and for a moment he wondered if his fingers would even move. Then he remembered the nights in his small apartment, the hours of practice, the neighbors listening, the children clapping outside. His window. He remembered the charity event where strangers stood to applaud, and most of all, he remembered the laughter of his coworkers, the mocking voice of his boss. "I'll make you CEO if you can play the piano." That memory steadied him. It was no longer just about proving them wrong. It was about proving to himself that he was more than they ever thought. He closed his eyes and pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost too soft, but it rang clear. Then another, then another. The notes joined together, forming a melody. At first, it was shaky, uncertain like a bird learning to fly. A few guests exchanged smirks, waiting for him to stumble. But then something changed. His hands grew steadier. The music began to flow, strong and beautiful. The hall grew quiet. The laughter faded. The conversations died. And soon the only sound was the piano. The notes filled the air like water filling an empty jar, slow and graceful, then faster and brighter. He poured his soul into every key, each note carrying his years of silence, his pain, his hidden strength. Some guests leaned forward, eyes wide, unable to believe what they were hearing. Others closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. The waiters stopped moving, holding their trays frozen in place. Even the children of the guests, who had been restless, sat quietly with awe. In their eyes, the boss, who had been smirking at the start, now sat stiff, his expression frozen, his lips no longer curved into a smile. He could not believe that the man he mocked daily was the one playing like this. Every note seemed to strike directly at his arrogance. The melody shifted, rising like a storm, powerful and commanding. The piano keys thundered beneath his fingers. The sound filled every corner of the hall. People felt it in their chests. Some placed hands over their hearts. The music was not just sound, it was emotion, raw and real. He remembered his mother's words. Every key has a voice, let it sing. And now he let them all sing. Voices of joy, voices of grief, voices of love, voices of hope. It was as if his entire life was speaking through the piano. The guests were spellbound. No one dared to move. No one dared to whisper. They were caught inside his music. When the melody softened again, turning gentle, it felt like a lullaby, comforting and tender. Some eyes in the audience grew misty. One woman dabbed her tears with a napkin. Another man cleared his throat roughly, pretending he wasn't moved. Then the finale came. His fingers flew across the keys, faster, stronger, pouring out everything he had. His hands were a blur. His chest rose and fell. His whole body leaned into the music as if he was part of the piano itself. The final notes rang out like bells, bright and sharp. And then there was silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The hall was completely still. The sound of the last note seemed to hang in the air, trembling like a memory that refused to fade. Then it happened. A single pair of hands clapped, then another, and then the whole hall erupted in applause. It was not polite clapping. It was thunderous. People stood to their feet. Some shouted, "Bravo!" Others whistled. The guests rose from their chairs, giving him a standing ovation. The sound of their praise was like a wave crashing over him. He lifted his head slowly, his eyes scanning the room. Faces were smiling. Eyes, the young man sat with his hands still resting on the keys. His head bowed, were glowing. People looked at him, not as the quiet worker, but as someone extraordinary, someone who had moved them. He bowed his head once, and the applause only grew louder. The boss did not clap. He sat frozen, his eyes dark, his mouth set in a thin line. He had wanted a joke, a failure, but instead he had witnessed something unforgettable. His power to mock suddenly felt smaller, weaker, in front of the truth of that performance. The young man stood and stepped back from the piano, his legs shaky but his heart strong. He knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. The laughter that once followed him would be replaced by respect. The whispers would no longer be cruel but filled with wonder. He had shown them who he truly was, and they could never unsee it. The guests kept clapping, some even moving toward the stage, eager to speak to him, to shake his hand. His co-workers looked on in disbelief, their mouths open, some embarrassed, forever laughing at him, others filled with pride as if they had always known. In that single performance, everything had changed. The quiet man had become the center of the room. His music had silenced every doubt, every insult, every cruel word. He was no longer invisible. He was unforgettable. And though the applause roared around him, inside his heart there was only one sound, the voice of his mother telling him that every key had a voice tonight. They had all sung, and the whole world had listened. The hall was still echoing with applause when he stepped back from the piano. The thunder of hands clapping and voices cheering shook the air. People were on their feet, smiling, clapping, shouting for more. Some even had tears in their eyes. No one expected this. No one thought the quiet man from the office could move them so deeply. Yet here he was, standing on stage, his chest rising and falling, his face glowing with sweat and emotion. He bowed his head slightly, shy but thankful, his eyes scanning the crowd. Everywhere he looked, he saw respect, admiration, even awe. Men in expensive suits who had come only to network were now whispering to each other about him. Women in elegant dresses were nodding and smiling warmly. Even the waiters who usually blended into the background clapped as hard as the guests. His co-workers, seated at one of the side tables, looked stunned, their mouths open. They had always seen him as the invisible man, the quiet one in the corner of the office, the one easy to ignore. But tonight he had turned into someone else, someone greater. Their laughter from weeks before now felt bitter in their throats. They exchanged nervous glances, ashamed of how they had mocked him. Some lowered their eyes, unable to face the truth that they had been wrong. One co-worker whispered, "He was practicing all this time, I should have known." Another said softly, "We laughed at him, and look at him now." Their voices carried both guilt and admiration. They knew they had underestimated him, and now they could never see him the same way again. The boss, however, sat frozen in his chair, his arms crossed tightly, his jaw clenched, his face pale. He could not clap, could not smile. He had been so sure this performance would be a disaster. He had imagined himself laughing louder than anyone. But instead he sat watching as the crowd cheered for the man he had humiliated. His smirk had vanished, replaced by disbelief and anger. Inside, the boss felt small. Every clap of the audience was like a blow to his pride. He realized that his joke had backfired. He had given the quiet man a stage, and instead of failing, he had shone brighter than anyone, the words he had once mocked him with. "I'll make you CEO if you can play." The piano now rang in his ears like a curse. As the applause continued, several important guests stood and walked toward the stage. One was a well-known businessman, gray-haired and respected. He extended his hand to the young man and said loudly, "That was extraordinary, young man, truly extraordinary." The crowd clapped again. Others followed, shaking his hand, praising him. "Where did you learn to play like that?" "You must perform more often." "Your music touched my heart." Voices rose from every direction. The young man shook their hands politely, bowing his head, his smile small but real. He was overwhelmed. Never had he received such praise. Never had people looked at him with such respect. For so long he had been invisible. But now he was the brightest presence in the room. His co-workers watched, speechless. Some felt pride now, as if his victory was also theirs. Though they knew in their hearts they had never supported him, still, they could not help but feel honored to work beside him. One of them whispered, "I'll never laugh at him again." Another nodded silently. Meanwhile, the boss's anger only grew. He forced a smile when an investor turned to him and said, "You didn't tell us you had such talent in your company. Impressive." But inside, the boss's pride was breaking. He had wanted the spotlight for himself. Yet tonight the young man had stolen it completely, and no matter what he did, he could not take it back. As the evening went on, more and more people approached the young man, asking questions, praising him, even offering connections. One woman invited him to perform at another event. A man asked for his contact information for a business gathering. He nodded humbly, not used to so much attention, but grateful. The boss finally stood and walked toward the stage, his smile forced, his steps stiff. He patted the young man's shoulder and said loud enough for the crowd to hear, "Well done, very well done." But his eyes carried no warmth, only frustration. The young man nodded politely, but inside he knew the truth. The boss was not happy. He was wounded, yet in that moment it did not matter. What mattered was the sound of the applause, the respect in people's eyes, and the feeling in his heart. He had proven himself, not by shouting, not by arguing, but by letting his music speak, and it had spoken louder than any insult. As the night came to an end, people were still talking about him. Some guests said his performance was the highlight of the evening. Others said they would never forget it. The young man walked home later. Under the quiet night sky, his body tired, his heart full. He knew the road ahead would still be hard. But now he had tasted something he had never known in the office. Recognition, respect, dignity. The next day at work, the atmosphere was different. People greeted him with new voices. Some even smiled kindly. His desk no longer felt invisible. His co-workers whispered not with laughter, but with admiration. That was him, the one who played last night. But the boss's eyes were colder than ever. Behind his forced calm there was a storm. He would not forget how his own mockery had turned into the young man's triumph. And though he tried to act unaffected, everyone in the office knew he had been shaken. For the young man, however, it was the beginning of something new. He had stepped into the light, and no one could push him back into the shadows again. The memory of the applause, the standing ovation, the shining eyes of the crowd stayed with him, whispering to him every moment that he was more than they thought, more than the laughter, more than the insult. He was someone who had found his voice, and he would never lose it again. The morning after the fundraiser felt different. The office was the same building, the same walls, the same desks, but the air had changed. People who once ignored him now looked at him when he walked in. Some gave small nods, others smiled politely. The whispers were not cruel anymore, they carried surprise and respect. "That's him, the one who played," someone murmured. "I never knew he had that in him," another said softly. He sat at his desk as always, quiet, steady, his hands moving across the keyboard of his computer, but deep inside he felt something new. He was no longer invisible, no longer a shadow. He carried with him the sound of the applause, the faces of the guests standing and clapping, the warmth in their eyes. It gave him strength. It gave him pride. The boss came in later, his face stiff, his steps heavy. He tried to act as if nothing had changed, but everyone could see the tension in his eyes. He called for a meeting, and when he spoke, his voice did not carry the same mocking power as before. The laughter was missing. The jokes were gone. He spoke about numbers, about targets, but the room felt different. People were no longer only listening to him. They kept glancing at the quiet man in the corner, as if he now carried a different kind of authority. The boss's own words haunted him. "I'll make you CEO if you can play the piano." The staff remembered it. They whispered about it. Some laughed quietly, not at the young man, but at the boss. The joke had turned on its master. The promise was absurd, yet it now stood as a symbol of the young man's victory.